When Louis Armstrong stepped onto the stage that night, everyone who had watched him for years knew something was different, but no one could have predicted what would actually happen. 1971, March, the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria. Louis was 70 years old, and his steps were heavier than ever before. His smile was in place, but behind his eyes there was something, a weariness, a weight, perhaps a farewell, hidden from view. When the performance began, something happened in the first verses. Louis paused. He lost the rhythm. He lowered the microphone to catch his breath. The hall fell silent. Then Louis began a song that wasn't on the program. He had never performed that song on stage before, and from the first note, everyone in the hall understood this wasn't an ordinary concert. This was a goodbye. So what really happened that night, and why did this concert go down in history as the most important performance of Louis Armstrong's life? The answer reveals one of the most emotionally devastating and beautiful moments in music history. A moment when a legend finally let the world see who he truly was behind the smile. If this story has already touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover will change the way you think about Louis Armstrong forever. But this story doesn't begin on that stage at the Waldorf Astoria. It begins 6 weeks earlier, in a hospital room in Queens, where Louis Armstrong sat in a chair by the window, staring at the gray February sky and wondering if he would ever perform again. Louis had been hospitalized for heart and kidney problems that had been worsening for years. The doctors had been direct. His body was failing. The decades of constant touring, the relentless schedule of performances, the physical demands of playing trumpet night after night for over 50 years, all of it had accumulated into a crisis that could no longer be ignored. "Mr. Armstrong, your heart is operating at less than 40% capacity," the lead physician had explained. "Your kidneys are struggling. If you continue performing, we cannot guarantee you will survive another 6 months." Louis had listened quietly, nodding occasionally, his famous smile nowhere to be seen. He had heard similar warnings before, had ignored them before, had pushed through pain and exhaustion because the stage was his home and music was his oxygen. But this time felt different. This time, even Louis couldn't pretend everything was fine. Louis had been admitted to Beth Israel Medical Center in early February after collapsing at home. His wife Lucille had found him on the bathroom floor, barely conscious, his breathing shallow and labored. The ambulance ride to the hospital had been terrifying for Lucille. She had spent over 30 years married to this man, had watched him give everything to his audiences while neglecting his own health, and now she was facing the very real possibility that she might lose him. At the hospital, doctors discovered that Louis's heart condition had deteriorated significantly since his last checkup. Fluid was accumulating in his lungs, making breathing difficult. His blood pressure was dangerously unstable, and the medical team stabilized him, but their prognosis was grim. Louis Armstrong needed to stop performing immediately and permanently if he wanted to live. For Louis, the idea of never performing again was worse than the idea of dying. He had been on stage since he was a teenager in New Orleans, playing cornet in the honky-tonks and dance halls of Storyville, learning his craft in the very birthplace of jazz. Music wasn't just his career, it was his identity, his purpose, his connection to everyone who had ever loved him or been moved by his art. When Louis imagined a life without performing, he saw emptiness, purposelessness, a slow fade into irrelevance and depression. "What am I supposed to do, Lucille?" Louis asked his wife one afternoon in the hospital. "Sit at home and watch television? Wait to die? That's not living. That's just existing." Lucille had no good answer because she understood him too well. She knew that taking away his music would kill him just as surely as his failing heart. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. During his hospital stay, Louis received hundreds of letters from fans around the world who had heard about his illness. Cards and flowers filled his room until the nurses had to start storing them in the hallway. Letters came from ordinary people who had been touched by his music, from fellow musicians who considered him a mentor and inspiration, from world leaders and celebrities who wanted to express their appreciation for everything he had contributed to American culture. Louis read every single letter, and each one reminded him why he had dedicated his life to music. A woman from Chicago wrote that "What a Wonderful World" had given her hope during her husband's illness. A veteran from the Korean War said Louis's trumpet playing had reminded him of home during the darkest days overseas. A young black musician from Detroit thanked Louis for proving that talent and persistence could break through barriers that seemed insurmountable. These letters weren't just expressions of admiration, they were evidence that Louis's music had genuinely mattered, had touched real lives, had made the world a slightly better place. By late February, Louis was well enough to return home to Corona, Queens, but not well enough to tour. The doctors made him promise to rest, to take his medications, to avoid stress and physical exertion. Louis agreed to everything they said, nodding solemnly while mentally calculating how soon he could get back on stage. Lucille watched her husband with a mixture of love and frustration, knowing he was planning something, knowing he would never truly give up performing no matter what the doctors ordered. She had learned over 30 years of marriage that Louis Armstrong was fundamentally incapable of saying no to an audience. He would perform until his body physically prevented him from continuing, and even then, he would probably try to play one more song. Have you ever loved something so much that you couldn't imagine life without it? Share your thoughts in the comments. The invitation to perform at the Waldorf Astoria Empire Room arrived in early March, and Louis's eyes lit up in a way Lucille hadn't seen since before his hospitalization. The Empire Room was one of New York's most prestigious venues, a place where the elite of entertainment and society gathered to see the best performers in the world. Louis had played there many times over the decades, and the invitation represented a return to the stage that his soul desperately craved. "Lucille, I have to do this," Louis told his wife. "One more show. Just one. The Waldorf. It's perfect." Lucille's heart sank because she knew she couldn't stop him, knew that refusing him this would be crueler than letting him risk his health. So she agreed, with conditions. Louis would perform a shortened set, would take breaks between songs, would have a doctor on standby backstage, would promise to stop immediately if he felt unwell. Louis agreed to everything, probably meaning none of it. The week before the Waldorf performance, Louis did something unusual. He began rehearsing a song he had never performed publicly. The song was deeply personal, connected to his childhood in New Orleans, connected to memories of his mother, Mary Ann, who had died when Louis was only 26 years old. Louis had recorded the song years earlier, but had always felt it was too intimate, too revealing, too raw to perform live. But something about knowing this might be his last performance made Louis want to finally share it. He practiced alone in his home music room, playing the melody on trumpet, singing the words with a voice that had grown rougher with age, but somehow more emotionally powerful. Lucille would sometimes stand outside the door listening, crying quietly because she could hear in Louis's voice that he was preparing to say goodbye, not just to his audience, but to music itself, to the life he had built, to everything he loved. The night of March the 16th, 1971, arrived with an electricity that everyone present would later describe as almost supernatural. The Waldorf Astoria's Empire Room was packed with admirers, industry executives, fellow musicians, and fans who had paid premium prices to see Louis Armstrong perform what many suspected might be one of his final concerts. Louis arrived at the venue early, something he rarely did, and spent an unusual amount of time alone in his dressing room. His valet and longtime friend Iramango later recalled that Louis seemed contemplative, almost melancholy, staring at his trumpet as if seeing it for the first time. "He was different that night," Iris said in an interview years later. "Usually Louis was all energy and jokes before a show, but that night he was quiet, like he was preparing for something important, something beyond just a performance." When Louis finally walked onto that stage, the applause was thunderous, the kind of ovation reserved for living legends, for artists whose contributions transcend entertainment and become part of cultural history. Louis smiled his famous smile, waved to the crowd, settled into his position at the microphone. But those who knew him well could see something different in his bearing. His steps were slower than usual. His shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight. His eyes, which normally sparkled with infectious joy, had a depth to them that suggested he was seeing beyond the immediate moment, seeing perhaps the entire arc of his extraordinary life. The band began playing and Louis raised his trumpet to his lips, but the first notes that emerged were uncertain, slightly off-pitch, lacking the effortless mastery that had defined his playing for decades. The audience noticed but said nothing, attributing it to age, to a bad night, to the natural decline that comes to all performers eventually. If you're feeling the emotion building in this story, please subscribe. What happens next will stay with you forever. The first half of the concert was marked by moments that concerned Louis's longtime fans and bandmates. He forgot lyrics to songs he had sung thousands of times. He paused between numbers longer than usual, clearly trying to catch his breath, clearly struggling more than he wanted anyone to know. At one point, Louis turned away from the microphone to cough, a deep, rattling cough that made Lucille, watching from a front table, grip her napkin so tightly her knuckles went white. The band covered for him professionally, extending instrumental sections to give Louis time to recover, adjusting arrangements on the fly to accommodate his limitations. But everyone on that stage knew something was wrong, something beyond the normal challenges of age and fatigue. Halfway through the concert, Louis did something that surprised everyone. He put down his trumpet and spoke directly to the audience. This wasn't unusual in itself. Louis often chatted with his audiences, telling jokes and stories between songs. But the tone of his voice was different tonight, softer, more reflective, almost confessional. "You know, folks, I've been doing this for a long time," Louis said, his gravelly voice filling the elegant room. "Started playing when I was just a kid in New Orleans, didn't have 2 pennies to rub together, didn't know where my next meal was coming from. Music saved my life back then. Gave me a purpose, gave me hope, gave me something beautiful to hold on to when everything else was ugly and hard." The room was absolutely silent, everyone sensing that Louis was about to share something important, something they had never heard him say before. Louis continued, his eyes seeming to look not at the audience, but through them, into some distant memory. "I've played for presidents and kings. I've traveled the whole world. I've had more blessings than any man deserves. But you know what I think about most? Not the big stages or the famous people. I think about my mama, Armstrong. She worked herself to exhaustion cleaning white folks' houses so I could eat. She never got to see me become anything. She died before I really made it, before I could give her anything back for all she sacrificed." Louis's voice cracked slightly, and the audience held their breath, witnessing something profoundly intimate from a man known for his public persona of constant joy and entertainment. "Tonight, I want to sing something I never sang on stage before, something I wrote for her a long time ago but never had the courage to share. I hope you'll forgive an old man for getting a little sentimental." What happened next became the defining moment of Louis Armstrong's final concert, and one of the most emotional performances in jazz history. Louis picked up his trumpet, closed his eyes, and began playing a melody so beautiful and so heartbreaking that several audience members immediately began crying. The song was unlike anything Louis typically performed, no showmanship, no entertainment value, just pure emotional expression. The melody was slow, almost mournful, but with an underlying warmth that suggested love rather than grief. It was the sound of a son remembering his mother, of an old man looking back at a lifetime of triumphs and losses, of someone saying goodbye to everything they held dear. When Louis began to sing, his voice was different from any recording ever made. Not the powerful, distinctive voice that had sold millions of records, but something raw, more vulnerable, stripped of all performance technique and left with only naked emotion. "Mama, can you hear me wherever you may be? Mama, I still love you, and I hope you're proud of me." The words were simple, almost childlike in their directness, but delivered with such sincerity that they cut through every defense and pretense in that sophisticated room. Executives who prided themselves on emotional control found tears rolling down their cheeks. Musicians who had heard every trick in the book sat in stunned silence, recognizing that this wasn't a trick at all. This was Louis Armstrong's soul, exposed completely for the first and last time. the song continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 4 or 5 minutes. Louis sang about the house in New Orleans where he grew up, about the smell of his mother's cooking, about the sound of her voice singing spirituals while she worked. He sang about leaving home to pursue music, about the guilt of not being there when she died, about the lifetime of success that she never got to witness. He sang about growing old and tired and wondering if any of it had mattered, wondering if she would be proud of the man he had become or disappointed by the compromises he had made along the way. And through it all, Louis's trumpet wove around his voice like a second narrator, adding musical commentary to the spoken grief, creating a duet between the man and the instrument that had been his constant companion for 60 years. When the song ended, Louis stood silent at the microphone, eyes still closed, trumpet hanging at his side. The room was absolutely still. No applause, no movement, no sound at all, except the soft crying of audience members who had been completely undone by what they had witnessed. Finally, Louis opened his eyes and looked out at the sea of faces, many of them tear-streaked, all of them transformed by what they had just experienced. "Thank you," Louis said simply. "Thank you for letting me share that with you. Thank you for everything." And then he smiled. Not his performance smile, not his public persona smile, but a gentle, peaceful, deeply genuine smile that seemed to radiate acceptance and gratitude. The applause that finally erupted was unlike anything the Waldorf Astoria had ever heard. People didn't just clap. They stood, they shouted, they wept openly while applauding. They tried to express through noise and motion what words couldn't capture. Louis stood on that stage receiving the ovation, and for once in his life, he didn't deflect it with humor or move quickly to the next song. He just stood there, letting the love wash over him, accepting it fully, understanding perhaps for the first time how much his music had meant to all these strangers who had become, through his art, something like family. Louis played 2 more songs after that, abbreviated versions of Hello Dolly and What a Wonderful World. But everyone present understood that the real performance had already happened. When Louis finally left the stage, helped by his valet because his legs were too unsteady to walk alone, the audience remained standing, still applauding, unwilling to let the moment end. Lucille was waiting backstage, and when Louis saw her, he collapsed into her arms. Not from physical weakness, though he was exhausted, but from emotional release. "I did it, Lucille," he whispered. "I finally did it. I finally told her." Lucille held him and cried, understanding that her meant Marianne, understanding that Louis had been carrying the weight of that unsaid goodbye for over 40 years. Louis Armstrong never performed publicly again after that night at the Waldorf Astoria. He had bookings scheduled for the summer and fall, but his body had given everything it had in that final performance, and there was nothing left. In the weeks following the concert, Louis's health declined rapidly. The heart problems worsened, the kidney function deteriorated, and Louis spent increasing amounts of time in bed, too weak to do much more than listen to music and receive occasional visitors. But those who saw him during those final months said there was a peace about Louis that hadn't been there before. The restlessness that had driven him to perform, even when performing was dangerous, had finally subsided, replaced by a quiet acceptance that felt earned rather than defeated. Louis Armstrong died in his sleep on July 6, 1971, at his home in Corona, Queens. He was 69 years old, just 2 days past his 70th birthday, which he had celebrated quietly with Lucille and a few close friends. The news of his death shocked the world, even though everyone knew he had been ill. There's something about legends that makes us believe they'll live forever, and Louis had been such a constant presence in American music for so long that his absence seemed impossible. Tributes poured in from around the world, from fellow musicians, from presidents and prime ministers, from ordinary fans who felt they had lost someone they personally knew and loved. The song Louis performed that night at the Waldorf Astoria was never officially recorded. There are rumors of bootleg recordings, of audience members who secretly taped the performance, but none have ever surfaced publicly. What remains are the memories of those who were present, memories that have become somewhat legendary in jazz circles, passed down from those who witnessed it to those who wish they had. Some details have undoubtedly been embellished over the years, as all memories are, but the core truth remains. On his final night on stage, Louis Armstrong stopped being an entertainer and became simply a human being, sharing his heart with strangers who became, in that moment, the closest of friends. Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful that it changed how you see the world? Tell us about it in the comments. The legacy of that final concert extends beyond the music Louis played. It demonstrated something that audiences rarely get to see: the real person behind the public persona, the vulnerability beneath the confidence, the humanity within the legend. Louis Armstrong spent his career making people happy. That was his mission, his calling, his reason for existence. But on that final night, he asked his audience for something in return. He asked them to witness his pain, his love, his regret, his gratitude. He asked them to see him not as Satchmo the entertainer, but as Louis the man, the son who missed his mother, the artist who wondered if his work had meaning, the mortal who knew his time was running out. Lucille Armstrong lived for another 12 years after Louis's death, dedicating much of that time to preserving his legacy. She worked with archivists and historians to organize Louis's papers, recordings, and memorabilia, eventually donating their home to Queens College to become the Louis Armstrong House Museum. In interviews, Lucille often spoke about that final concert at the Waldorf Astoria, describing it as the moment when Louis finally allowed himself to be fully seen. "He spent his whole life giving people what they wanted," Lucille said. "Joy, entertainment, escape from their troubles. But that night, he gave them something else, himself, the real Louis. And I think that's why it mattered so much to everyone who was there." Today, more than 50 years after that night, the Waldorf Astoria concert remains a subject of fascination among jazz historians and Louis Armstrong fans. Some consider it his greatest performance, not because of technical brilliance, but because of emotional honesty. Others view it as a cautionary tale about artists who give too much of themselves, who sacrifice their health and well-being for their art. But perhaps the truest interpretation is simply this: Louis Armstrong lived for music, and when the time came to say goodbye, he did it the only way he knew how, by making music that mattered more than any he had made before. The song Louis sang about his mother was never given an official title. Some who heard it that night called it Mama's Song. Others referred to it as the Waldorf Farewell. But Lucille, in her private notes, called it something else entirely: Louis's Truth. Because that's what it was, the truth that Louis had carried for over 40 years, finally spoken aloud in the only language he truly knew: the language of music. And in speaking that truth, in sharing that pain and love and regret with an audience of strangers, Louis Armstrong created something that transcended entertainment and became art in its purest form. Louis Armstrong's trumpet now rests in the Smithsonian Institution, alongside other artifacts of American cultural history. His voice continues to play on radios and streaming services around the world, bringing joy to new generations who never saw him perform live. But for those who were present at the Waldorf Astoria on that March night in 1971, no recording could ever capture what they experienced. They witnessed something rare and precious: a legend removing his mask, a performer becoming a person, a man saying goodbye to everything he loved with a grace and honesty that few humans ever achieve. They witnessed Louis Armstrong's truth, and that truth, unlike the man who spoke it, will never die. Every time someone listens to "What a Wonderful World" and feels their heart lift, Louis Armstrong is still performing. Every time a young musician picks up a trumpet and dreams of changing the world through music, Louis Armstrong is still teaching. Every time a person chooses joy over cynicism, chooses connection over isolation, chooses to share their true self with others despite the risk of vulnerability, Louis Armstrong is still inspiring. That's the real legacy of that final concert. Not the sadness of an ending, but the beauty of a life fully lived and fully expressed. Louis Armstrong stepped onto that stage knowing it might be his last performance, and he chose to make it count. He chose to be brave. He chose to be honest. He chose to be human. And in doing so, he reminded everyone present, and everyone who has heard this story since, that the most powerful music isn't about technique or talent. It's about truth. It's about heart. It's about having the courage to say what needs to be said, even when saying it terrifies you. Louis Armstrong's last concert revealed the heartbreaking truth that behind the smile was a man who had spent his whole life missing his mother, wondering if she would be proud, wishing he could tell her one more time that he loved her. But it also revealed something else, something beautiful, that Louis's music had given him a way to say everything he couldn't say in words, and that when he finally found the courage to combine words with music, the result was something that touched every soul in that room and continues to touch souls more than 50 years later. That's the power of music. That's the legacy of Louis Armstrong. And that's why, on a March night in 1971, a room full of strangers wept together, not for what they were losing, but for what they had been given.